Hello everyone. Today let us see the poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats by w.h.auden. Auden was a famous British American poet. He also produced essays, reviews, and plays apart from poems. His main sources of inspiration are from religion, politics, morality, and humans' connection with nature. He gained his public prominence with his first book, Poems, at the age of 23 in 1930. Now, this poem, In Memory of W.B. Yeats, was written in 1939 after the death of William Butler Yeats, the famous Irish poet and dramatist. So, the Second World War and Auden's personal move to New York served as the backdrop for this poem in memory of W.B. Yeats. This poem is a slight deviation from the conventional elegies because it not only laments Yeats's passing away, but it also speaks about the poet's life and work, and it even provides some critique. Now let us go into the explanation of the poem. This poem consists of three sections. And now let us see the first stanza of the first section. Let me read the first stanza. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted, and snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. What instruments we have agree the day of his death was a dark, cold day. So William Butler Yeats passed suddenly in the dead of winter. So he here mentioned as W.B. Yeats. He disappeared. W.B. Yeats disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks, which are nothing but the water streams, they were frozen. The airports almost deserted. There was nobody in the airport, and the airports were abandoned. And snow disfigured the public statues. So the public sculptures, they were all covered by the snow and it distorted the shape of the statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. So the thermometer readings showed the icy temperature. What instruments we have agree. So whatever instruments we have to measure the day's weather, everything confirms the day of W.B. Yeats's death was truly dark and cold. So that's what the last line says. The day of W.B. Yeats's death was a dark, cold day. Now moving on to the second stanza. Far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forests. The peasant river was untempted by the fashionable keys. By moaning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. So the second stanza, the speaker describes how, despite the death of this great poet, the world goes on. Yeats was actually ill, but life went on in Ireland as usual, despite, irrespective of the weather. So the second line says, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forests. The wolves are still running through the forests, and the peasant river was untempted by the fashionable keys. Here, the word Quays, it should be pronounced as keys. So in the next slide, I'll show you a picture. What does it mean, keys? By mourning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. So here now the wolves were still running through the forests, and the peasant river is untempted by the more fashionable keys. And the poem describes about the human reaction to the poet's death. And the speaker here is bothered by that. By mourning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. So his poems are kept away from his death, which means that the readers read Yeats's poems, his death will not be heavy on their minds when they read Yeats's poems. They continue on. That is, the poems, they'll continue on just as the people do, unchanged by the death of the poet. Now the third stanza. But for him, for him here is W.B. Yeats, it was his last afternoon as himself, an afternoon of nurses and rumours. The provinces of his body revolted. The squares of his mind were empty. Silence invaded the suburbs. The current of his feeling failed. He became his admirers. So the third stanza gives the reader a very human picture of Yeats's death. So his last moments were spent around nurses in the hospital, and there were rumors about the illness of Yeats. And why the first line says that, but for him it was his last afternoon as himself. So Yeats was himself, and it was his last afternoon, and an afternoon of nurses and rumors. So he was surrounded by nurses, and also rumors were spread. The provinces of his body revolted. So here Auden depicts Yeats's body at war with itself. So the different parts of his body are all were revolted, and his body revolted against itself and the squares. Here the squares meant the architecture of a city square. Of his mind were empty. There was nothing but silence in the suburbs. So silence invaded the suburbs. The current of his feeling failed. He became his admirer. So now Yeats died, and Yeats became the admirers, started admiring Yeats. So he has became his admirers, the peoples, that is the people who loved Yeats's poems. So Yeats became his admirers. So I mentioned in the last slide as keys. So the pathway here, which will be used for exporting and importing. So this was meant in the stanza. Now moving on to the next stanza. Now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections, to find his happiness in another kind of word, and be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. So in the fourth stanza, the speaker describes how Yeats's soul and essence are scattered among 100 cities among all his admirers. People would be reading his poems among all the cities. Yeats himself suffered from physical and mental degeneration, leaving only his admirers to appreciate his wonderful poems. So, Yeats continues to exist through his dispersed poetry, which reaches the cities and the readers and the critics who are unfamiliar with him and who change his life and poems according to their own perspectives. So that's what here it is said, and wholly given over to unfamiliar affection. So his poems, it was given over to unfamiliar affections, to find his happiness in another kind of wood. Here Auden mentions that Yeats is still living as his soul lives in the other world, but he has no control over how he is judged now by his own admirers. So he is in the guts of the living where his words are modified. The way of being is different, strange, and unfamiliar to the poet. So once again, Auden speaks on how the human world is going on without past in the next stanza. But in the importance and noise of tomorrow, when the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floor of the booths, and the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom. A few thousand will think of this day as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. So here Auden speaks on how the human world is going on without giving any pass for the death of the Yeats. So here he uses a simile to describe how the brokers are roaring like beasts. So they are back to work. They started working again. On the bourse means a stock exchange. It's a French word which means a stock exchange, or the Paris version of Wall Street. He also describes the poor as back to normal as well. They suffer as they always do. So here, and the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed. They started adjusting with their sufferings. And each in the cell here means imprisoning oneself, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom. So they stopped caring about the freedom. They are almost convinced of the freedom that was with them. So each in their own prison. A few thousand will think of this day as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. So Yeats's death is only one more moment of unpleasantness in the world, and it also passes just like everything else does. Now moving on to the last two lines. Again, it is a kind of a repetition, or you can call it as a refrain. What instruments we have agree, the day of his death was a dark, cold day. Once again, he confirms the day that Yeats died was a very dark and cold day. Now with that, the first section ended. Now we'll move on to the second section of this poem. So the second part of the poem in Memory of W.B.Yeats is only one stanza long. You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all. The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still. For poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to tamper, flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives a way of happening, a mouth. So now, in the beginning of this stanza, you can see the speaker calls or addresses aids as you. So there is a shift from the third person to the second person. Here you were silly like us, you were also silly like us. Your gift survived it all. That is the gift of writing, survived. Your poetry survived it all. The parish of rich women. Here, Auden might be mentioning about Yeats's friendship with rich women, as Yeats himself belonged to a elite society, and his own physical decay. Physical decay yourself. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. So Ireland is still as mad as it was, and Yeats's poetry in the end has made no difference. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still. For poetry makes nothing happen. So this is a very powerful line that strike at the heart of one's perception on the possibility of literature to bring change. Now the next line, it survives in the valley, that is poetry survives in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to tamper, flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. So the speaker explains that nothing changed in the world due to Yeats's poetry, as poetry is not supposed to do something wielded for a change. It is meant to do something different, something more ephemeral. The speaker says that poetry, like water, it enters into the ranches of isolation and the busy griefs. Poetry travels from place to place and it is left untouched, and it is a way of happening, a mouth. So it moves on, poetry moves on, just not in the way Yeats might have sometimes hoped. Now this is the last section of the poem. Earth, now w.h.auden, he calls on the earth. Earth, receive an honored guest, who is nothing but W.B. Yeats. William Yeats. Now he had disclosed the name of the poet here. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie, emptied of its poetry. Now the third section begins with Auden addressing the earth, and this part of the poem takes the form of an elegy or a work written in dedication to someone recently died. He asks it to revive Yeats's body where he is laid to rest. This is also the first time that W.B. Yeats is mentioned by W.h.auden, and he was a vessel for his poetry. And now that's all that remains. It is empty of the poetry it once held. Now the second stanza. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. So the second stanza of this section, it gives the reader a few more details about the death of the poet. It occurred in 1939 in the lead up to the World War II. A nightmare is on its way, and that is the nightmare refers here is to the World War II, and all the dogs of Europe bark at its approach, the approach of the war. The nations of the world are sequestered, they are separated from one another. They were basking in individual hate. This separation and those differences are at the source of the conflict here. Now, intellectual disgrace stares from every human face, and the seas of pity lie locked and frozen in each eye. So here W.H.Auden might have said, even though there were great war poets like Owen and w.b.yeats and all, they were all against war. The normal people, every individual, they would have stared at these poets with a kind of pity. So the pity was locked and frozen in each person's eyes. They were not able to do anything against the war. They cannot stop the war. So they consider it as an intellectual disgrace. Follow, poet, follow right to the bottom of the night with your unconstraining voice. Still persuade us to rejoice. With the forming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to prize. So the speaker celebrates Yeats's ability to look into the bottom of the night with his unconstraining voice, unlimited voice. It was a tool that allowed him to see very clearly, and it still has power as well. This is another example of life after the death that was so important in the first part of the poem. Now, Auden here uses dark images in the fifth stanza to suggest how Yeats would have spoken about the state of the world during the Second World War. So he would sing of the human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. The second stanza, it says that. Now in the final stanza, the speaker's tone lightens, as does the imagery also lightens here. The image of water once again appears here. The healing fountain should start in the hearts of men. The poem ends very optimistically, but also with a dark image of the human condition. He states that life is a prison, and that by spending time with poetry, specifically with the poetry of Yeats, one can learn how to prize or to be hopeful. So here the last section ends. Now we can conclude like this. Auden's poetry was renowned for its technical mastery and the depth of the thoughts. He also experimented with several literary forms and genres, and he found both classical and modernist uh, poets as his inspiration, and also he had taken sources from their works and took it as an inspiration. So that's all about In Memory of W.B. Yeats by W.H.Auden. Thank you very much for watching.